Hey guys, welcome back to Sleepy History. Are you tired of the same old monarchs on the throne? Kings and queens making the big decisions, running countries like they own the place? Well, it's time for a change. Say hello to the Royal Kids Takeover. That's right. Today we're diving into the messy, dramatic, ridiculous world of royal children, those pint-sized power players who really shake things up. Don't worry, it's not all about kings and queens, because in the past, some rulers had kids who strayed pretty far from the royal road. This week, we'll be checking out a few of the most fascinating tales of royal offspring. There are princes who accidentally murdered their fathers, a royal pig assassination plot, and a tale that will make you wonder if the phrase, monkey see, monkey do, really originated in the medieval period. So grab some tea, get comfy, and let's dive into the Royal Rumble jungle. Buckle up, because the next generation of leaders had a pretty rough ride sometimes. Take, for instance, young Edward VI. When his father, Edward V, died in 1377, Edward VI was only 10 years old. But hold the phone. Was he really the next in line? Meet the infamous Richard II, Edward V's younger brother, who was shoved aside when his dad decided to play musical chairs with the throne. But that's a story for another time. Back to our boy Edward VI. At first glance, his rise to the throne seemed like your typical fairy tale. He was young, dashing, and ready to take on the world with his mother, Queen Elizabeth of Windsor, by his side. But let's just say their relationship was a bit more Sleeping Beauty meets Snow White. Yeah, that doesn't sound good. Richard III, after a quick detour to save his own royal bacon, scooped up the crown jewel of England. And young Edward found himself tucked away in the Tower of London. Talk about a royal rumble in the jungle. Now, let's not judge too hard. It wasn't uncommon for royal families to play musical chairs with the throne in the Middle Ages. But sometimes these power struggles didn't end with just a few kids taking a turn on the throne. And Edward VI's story is a prime example. After his dad kicked the bucket, his mom, Joan, Countess of Kent, decided she needed to step into the ring. Unfortunately, her royal opponent was none other than her former BFF, Isabella of France, who was married to the aforementioned Richard III. But hey, who needs friends when you've got enemies, right? These royal rivals were ready to rumble, willing to abandon their royal duties just to secure a seat at the power table. But let's face it, this royal rumble wasn't just about the throne. These ladies had some serious issues to settle. While history may not remember all the details of their feud, one thing's for sure, it was epic. And if you thought that was dramatic, wait till we tell you about Lady Jane Grey. This young noble lady was thrust into the spotlight when she was asked to take the throne. Sure, she had royal blood in her veins, but the real reason she was tapped was because her family pulled off one of the sneakier royal coups in history. And when I say sneaky, I mean sneakier than a ninja on a stealth mission. Lady Jane, barely 17 years old, found herself in the royal ring thanks to a secret plan hatched by her family. They knew she wasn't the rightful heir, but they were willing to break all the rules to get her on the throne. Talk about a power move. Unfortunately, her reign was shorter than a royal pig's life. After a mere 9 days, she was ousted and sent packing. That's right, she was dethroned faster than you can say Royal Rumble. But this young queen wasn't just a pawn in her family's game. She was smart, savvy, and ready to rumble for her beliefs. Despite her family's scheming, Lady Jane stayed true to her convictions and refused to play their dirty games. And let's face it, that kind of loyalty deserves a standing ovation. But the royal stage wasn't just a place for young princes and princesses. Oh no. Sometimes even the biggest power players had kids who weren't afraid to shake things up. Take Henry VIII's son, Henry Fitzroy. This royal rebel wasn't content with just following in his father's footsteps. He wanted to blaze his own trail, even if it meant going against the grain. Unlike his dad, Henry Fitzroy had no interest in playing the kingly game. He didn't want to court the masses. He wanted to court the outdoors. The young prince was happiest when he was out exploring nature, tracking animals, and living life on his own terms. But let's face it, this royal renegade didn't just love nature, he loved living life on the edge. While his father ruled with an iron fist, Henry Fitzroy was busy making mischief and causing chaos wherever he went. Talk about a royal pain in the neck. But you know what? Henry Fitzroy wasn't just a troublemaker. He was a trailblazer, a true original who dared to be different in a world that expected him to be just like his father. And if that doesn't scream rock and roll, I don't know what does. And let's not forget about Edward VI. Yep, him again. After his brief stint in the Tower of London, he was back in the Royal Rumble, albeit in a very different arena. When his older brother, Edward V, kicked the bucket, Edward VI was back in the spotlight. But this time, he wasn't just a kid in the royal jungle. He was now the top predator. And let us just say he brought a whole new meaning to the phrase, Reign of Terror. From his first day on the throne, Edward VI made it clear that he wasn't messing around. He was young, he was hungry for power, and he was ready to rule with an iron fist. And while he may have started out as a pint-sized prince, by the time his reign came to an end, he was a full-blown royal powerhouse. So there you have it, folks. The Royal Rumble isn't just a playground for kids. It's a battleground where young princes and princesses learn the art of survival. They scheme, they fight, they betray, and they come out swinging. Just remember, behind every great monarch is a long line of ambitious heirs waiting for their chance to rumble in the jungle. Now, before we go, I have a question for you. Have you ever met a kid who surprised you with their ambition and drive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode of Royal Rumble. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride through the world of royal offspring. And until next time, keep an eye on those pint-sized power players because they just might be the next big thing. And hey, if you're still hungry for more royal misadventures, don't forget to check out our website. We've got all sorts of royal mishaps waiting to be discovered, so click on over and let the Royal Rumble continue. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, in the game of royal thrones, you snooze, you lose. Bye. Part 2, hey there, it's me. Welcome back to my channel. We're cruising through the weird world of royal mishaps, this time diving into the question, what happens when royalty takes the whole marry your cousin thing a bit too seriously? You know that old saying, a curiosity killed the cat? Well, when it comes to some royal lineages, you could swap cat for entire species. Seriously, have you ever browsed the family trees of European royalty? It looks like a bad case of hookworms. Everyone's related to everyone else. But why? Was it just a quirk of royal etiquette or a secret plot to create the next generation of mutant superheroes? Well, both. Actually, first off, let's take a quick detour to explain why royal families were so into cousinly love. Because while it sounds odd to our modern ears, back then it was actually pretty standard practice. No, really, historically, it was considered safer and smarter to marry within your extended family. Why? Two main reasons. One, keeping it in the family meant keeping control in the family. Kings and queens didn't want their hard-earned crowns going to some random outsider. So by marrying cousins, they ensured the next monarch would be someone they hand-picked, literally. Two, it was also a matter of convenience. Back then, diplomacy was as much about marriage as war. Marrying your cousin might sound gross now, but it was a way of forging alliances without making actual alliances. So let's start with the most famous messed-up royal family tree, the Spanish Habsburgs. Okay, so we all know the story of Charles II, the heir to a vast dynasty and a small bladder. And yeah, that bladder issue was pretty legendary, but it wasn't his fault. His entire lineage had been intermarrying like rabbits since the 15th century. Let's look at his parents, Philip III and his wife Margaret. Yep, first cousins once removed. Now let's go back 2 more generations to Charles's grandparents, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and his wife Isabella. Yep, you guessed it, first cousins. That's right. Charles II was essentially the product of 4 grandparents, all of whom were first cousins. And it gets weirder. Charles V himself was the grandson of another set of first cousins, Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy. Honestly, at this point, you could make a family tree flowchart where 90% of the lines just say, first cousins. But hold on, because we haven't even gotten to the truly messed up part. Charles II was the last king of Spain's Habsburg dynasty. His successor was a Bourbon king, hinting at a different, less intermingled family tree. Why the switch? Well, after centuries of cousin marriages, the Habsburg bloodline started producing a lot of kids who couldn't produce more kids. By the time Charles II came around, only one Habsburg woman, Maria Theresa, had managed to give birth to a full-term baby girl in the previous century. The rest were either boys who died young or girls who couldn't produce children. In fact, historians debate whether Charles II was even biologically a Habsburg. Some claim his mother, Margaret, might have had an affair with someone else given how uncommon successful pregnancies were in her family. All of this makes Charles II a possible black sheep, except he might have been the norm in a very messed up flock. So, that's a win, I guess? Moving on, we have the Danish royal family, a slightly less infamous but equally inbred bunch. They took the cake in terms of duration. They were doing the cousin thing way back in the 14th century and kept it up till the 18th century. Over 400 years of cousin marriage means we're talking seriously deep cuts in the family album. Let's zoom in on Christian IV, King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Yeah, 3 kingdoms, but that's beside the point. Christian IV was the product of his parents, Frederick VI and Sophie of Saxony, first cousins. Now, 2 generations earlier, we find Christian III, the king who kicked off this whole cousin craze in Denmark. He wed his cousin Queen Margaret, setting the stage for decades of royal fraternization. But why did they do it? We have one royal scandal to thank. Christian III's sister, Isabella, had a thing for handsome young men. Not a problem, except she happened to be betrothed to the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. So she broke it off. And you know what happened next? She chose to marry her cousin, Christian. Instead, cementing the family business of choosing partners based on blood ties rather than chemistry. Oh, and speaking of, Christian III and his wife Margaret, yep, you guessed it, first cousins. Fun fact, Christian IV's mother, Sophie, was also Queen of Sweden for a brief period. Yet another reminder that while this is Denmark's story, this is also a tale of entangled royal families across Europe. Speaking of tangled, the tangled cord around your baby's umbilical cord is an amazing source of DNA for ancestry testing. But wait, aren't you too young to be thinking about genealogy? Well, you're on to something. After all, everyone's favorite family stories usually start with once upon a time. And now, with just a few clicks, you can add some real history to those tales. So the Danish royals were doing their cousin thing for a millennium, but what about the Italians? Enter the House of Este, ruling over Ferrara, Modena, and Reggio in Italy during the Middle Ages. They held the title of Dukes of Ferrara, and their tenure lasted from 1293 to 1325. And sure, that doesn't sound like a long time, but considering how messy their family tree was, they crammed a lot of cousin action into those 3 centuries. Here's how it went down. The founder of the house was Obizzo, who decided he liked his cousin Azzo so much that he married her. Not a problem. A few generations later, we meet Francesco I, who married his cousin, Parisina Malatesta. Skip a few more generations, and we arrive at Niccolo III, who, you guessed it, married his cousin, Caterina, each generation picking up right where the last one left off. But you might be wondering, how did everyone stay sane? Or if they did stay sane, how does anyone function after that much family bonding? Well, the answer is they didn't really stay sane. The Esters were known for their art patronage, commissioning some of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. But their castles were also a backdrop for endless betrayals, murders, and power struggles. Even their art reflected the darkness brewing beneath the surface. One famed painting shows Parisina trapped in a tower, perhaps foreshadowing the fates of many women in the family. And here's the kicker. While the male heirs married their female cousins, the daughters followed suit. Nicholas III's sister, Beatrice, married her cousin, Francesco II, keeping the chain alive. So while other royal houses took breaks, vacationed, took sabbaticals, or just stopped to breathe, the Esters were all in on the cousin marriage Olympics. And for all their artistic patronage, their palaces echoed with secrets, lies, and maybe a hint of incest. It's a cautionary tale for anyone considering the cousin marriage lifestyle. Now, as we wrap up this royal train wreck tour, remember, if you like this journey through matrimonial mayhem, there's a whole world of royal screw-ups out there just waiting to be uncovered. Just remember, behind every powerful dynasty, there's a mountain of complicated family drama. So if you ever find yourself wielding great power, maybe skip the cousin marriage thing. Thanks for joining me on this royal roller coaster. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and remember, sometimes the craziest family dramas are the ones that shaped history. Until next time, keep exploring. Who knows, you might stumble upon your own royal mishap waiting to be uncovered. Now, if you're awake, you're probably thinking, "Come on, narrator, it's late. Even my eyelids are drooping. Why are you inflicting this awful alliteration on me?" To which I reply, "Shh, hush. This is educational television or radio. Well, whatever it is you call this format." But if you are still with us, let's talk about those monarchs who may have been genetically sound, but whose personalities turned their reigns into disasters. I'm talking about the kings and queens who either had the stuff rulers are usually made of, or they just pretended to be competent while secretly being almost entirely incompetent. Either way, their names became synonymous with terrible decisions, questionable choices, and the general unsuitability for wearing crowns. So let's slip into our metaphorical smoking jackets and sit by the virtual fireplace as we roll our eyes at some of history's least qualified royals. Oh, hello, lovely evening. I see you haven't fallen asleep yet. Excellent. Then let's discuss Ivan the Terrible. Because if you're going to have a disastrous reign, you might as well go all out. Ivan Vasilievich, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, whatever you want to call him, he stands as a massive middle finger to anyone suggesting that being related isn't a prerequisite for being bad at your job. Ivan ascended to the throne of Russia in 1533 at just 13 years old. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, had recently died, leaving Ivan as the somewhat green but official ruler. Although, as we'll see, green barely begins to describe him. Ivan grew up resenting his advisors and counselors, which is understandable, considering they likely spoon-fed him nothing but bland gruel. As a result, when he took the throne, he promptly fired them, deciding to rule alone. This may not have been ideal, but it was certainly his choice. Unfortunately, the rest of his story reads like a list of terrible decisions. He brutally murdered his son, earning him the unwanted title of Ivan the Terrible. He created a secret police force that stalked his court, spying on everyone and executing anyone suspected of disloyalty. He launched needless wars, squandered money, and generally made Russia significantly more horrible than it was before. In short, he took something already challenging, being Russian in the 1500s, and cranked the suckage up to 11. As always, though, we must ask how much of this was due to his personality and how much was due to his genes. On the surface, it looks like pure toxicity, but Ivan was the product of centuries of Romanov rule, a dynasty that had isolated its bloodline so successfully that inbreeding was basically a state religion. Add a dash of possible lead poisoning, and you get one seriously messed up monarch. So let's pop open another bottle of our metaphorical wine and raise a glass to Charles II of England. Charles II came to power in 1848 after a long and eventful childhood. He'd witnessed the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, Napoleon's rise and fall, and his counselors murdering Marie Antoinette. So you could forgive him for wanting to keep things quiet. Problem was, he also had the personality of overcooked spaghetti. You know, all soft and wilted. Parliament passed laws. Charles reluctantly signed them. People cheered. Charles stared blankly ahead. Essentially, Charles II was the human equivalent of a potted plant. But while plants can bring a room to life, Charles brought a room down several notches in temperature. Charles ascended to the throne as the king of bling, but his tastes ran more toward brocade and cabbage. His fashion sense combined with his general apathy, which was like watching a rave culture performance from a Beatle. All style and no substance. Yet somehow even worse. He was vain, easily influenced, and preferred hunting to governing. He surrounded himself with sycophants who encouraged his worst habits. There's a famous story of him losing his dentures and wandering around the palace in agony for hours before someone found them. Not exactly the stuff of legends, but it sure sounds humiliating. Now, it's tempting to blame his upbringing, but the truth is, Charles had a stable childhood. He just chose to be this way. Maybe he had undiagnosed clinical depression, maybe he was simply born boring. Whatever the reason, his reign was notable for exactly nothing except maybe the creation of a truly horrendous wig collection. So let's serve up a bitter slice of humble pie with the figure of Edward VIII. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. Yes, that was his real name. And I'm not saying it to make fun of him. No, that would be cruel and mean. I'm saying it because it reflects the kind of man he was. Burdened with expectations, saddled with traditions, and fundamentally unable to live on his own terms. From the time he was born, Edward knew his path. He'd become king. So he planned accordingly. He traveled extensively. He took on extra responsibilities in World War I. He flirted with the arts. He learned to fly planes. Basically, he prepared himself for a glorious reign. Except he totally misread the memo. Edward ascended to the throne in 1936 at 62 years old, having spent his whole life preparing for this moment. He immediately gave up the role, abdicating in favor of his younger brother, George VI. His brief and bizarre explanation, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." And just like that, the longest training montage in history resulted in a 2-minute elevator pitch for a reality TV show. But don't worry, he clarifies. I don't want to be a burden. Look, it's fine. Honestly, let George have it. I mean, he's taller. I've always been the shorter twin, you know. In reality, it wasn't all about Wallace Simpson, the twice-divorced American he wanted to marry. It was about the freedom he craved. A king is defined by the crown he wears, and Edward just didn't want to wear that crown. The problem is, he was still very much a Windsor, meaning he still had the chutzpah to be royal, but none of the qualifications to wield power. In short, Edward abdicated because he had spent a century preparing to rule, and in the end, he simply wasn't interested. And now it's time for our next cozy historical tale.
Henry VIII has gone down in history as a tyrant, a religious reformer, a conqueror. He's had a surprisingly large impact on the world. But what did he do during his downtime? Surprisingly, for a man who executed 2 of his wives, he liked nothing more than domesticity. At least that's according to his biographers. They describe Henry as a loving father, especially to his daughter Mary. He read to her, took her hunting, danced with her, and walked by her side as a miniature queen consort. He did the same with his daughter Elizabeth, though their relationship cooled after Elizabeth's mother was executed. But then there was the small matter of the wives he murdered, and the rest of the children he largely ignored. Maybe his real passion was interior design. We get a hint from a poem written around 1540, addressed to "My Dearest Husband." Most of it is taken up with descriptions of household projects and furnishings, right down to how velvet cushions were fixed on stools. These weren't exactly grand concerns for a king, but they were Henry's. When you think about it, this domesticity fits the medieval mindset. Kingship was basically an extension of managing a household. Peasants paid taxes just as servants paid fees. A lord's wife managed his estate just as his queen might manage a royal building project. And everyone followed the orders of the male head of the household. As the medieval writer Christine de Pizan put it, the king must be obeyed absolutely in all things. So when Henry VIII delighted in decorating rooms, he was really acting like an especially rich lord of a manor. His favorite residence was Whitehall Palace, where he installed a massive fountain in the Great Hall. He later moved to the palace at Greenwich, where he delighted in landscaping the gardens and decorating the walls with new tapestries. In fact, he was so enthusiastic about decorating that he once dispatched 6 men to scour England for old tapestry hangings, then had them restored and sent to Greenwich. In the end, Henry probably wasn't much of a kingly king, but he was a terrific interior decorator. Louis XIV of France had different hobbies. He loved hunting. Over the course of his long life, he hunted tens of thousands of animals, particularly deer. He created special parks near Versailles, where hundreds of deer grazed, then stalked them during walks that could last for hours. Louis took such pleasure in tracking down his prey that he designed special hunting lodges where he could rest between chases. He liked to follow trails all over France. On one occasion, he spent 8 days walking around the forest of Fontainebleau. To stay fit for all this running around, Louis took long walks. According to his doctor, he averaged 25 miles per day. He also used a special treadmill in his apartments at Versailles, which he apparently preferred to riding a horse. For our American viewers, that sounded weird too. But no king was more obsessed with food than James I of England. In fact, his fondness for eating became a national scandal. During his reign, Parliament tried to limit the size of his meals because they felt it was outrageous. But James wasn't having it. "I have heard," he said to Parliament, "that some have been so bold as to wish that I would eat less. But my answer is that I could never eat amiss." There may have been something to that claim. Some estimates suggest that over his lifetime, James ate over 30,000 chickens, along with prodigious amounts of venison, beef, mutton, swan, peacock, rabbit, eel, fish, and bread. Of course, those meals required lots of wine, and James developed a taste for France's finest vintages, collecting thousands of bottles. The king's favorite meal consisted of 3 dishes of swan, each prepared in a different way. One was roasted with spices and covered in gold leaf. Another was stewed with medicinal herbs. The third was boiled and seasoned with nutmeg. He liked it all washed down with a flagon of Canary wine, a thick, sweet wine from the Canary Islands. James was so devoted to the stuff that he actually brought some vines back to England and planted them at Greenwich House. But no medieval ruler was more famous for his odd habits than Ivan the Terrible of Russia. He was a cruel, violent man who ruled with terror, but he also suffered from debilitating neuroses. Historians debate whether he had epilepsy or some other sickness, but its symptoms followed him all his life. He experienced terrifying seizures that left him twitching and babbling. His limbs shook uncontrollably, and his eyes rolled wildly in his head. At his worst moments, he would foam at the mouth and bite down hard on his own tongue. Unsurprisingly, these spells left him exhausted. Ivan the Terrible was notorious for sleeping for days at a time. He would crawl into bed wearing a nightgown, then refuse to come out until it was time for dinner. Even then, he was too tired to eat. Instead, he would have his food ground into a liquid, then drink it straight from the mortar. He also developed a disturbing habit of biting his fingers so hard that he broke the bones. He was especially fond of eating the flesh off his thumbs. Unsurprisingly, this made writing and eating painful. His solution: hire someone to feed him while he dictated letters. Yvonne would dictate everything from state policy to personal matters, like asking for fresh cherries, bread, wine, and plums. He also demanded food while he slept. Servants reported carrying trays of soup into Ivan's bedroom at night and watching him drink hungrily from a spoon. Of course, his night nurse wasn't the only one. As Ivan aged, he became convinced that he was being poisoned. First, he suspected his wife, then his son, then everyone else in his inner circle. So he hired an army of food tasters and night nurses to watch over him. It was hardly an improvement. One of his last night nurses was a former serf named Ossip, who was given the title Prince Borshik. He watched over Ivan for 12 years, but that didn't make him any less terrified. Every time, he wrote, "When I went to fetch a spoonful of soup, I trembled lest my master should die during the interval between the time when I had drunk the broth and that when he partook of it." Rulers like Ivan the Terrible had plenty of nervous habits. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, couldn't stop biting his fingernails. His counselors despaired over the damage it was doing to his looks, and it got worse over time. Eventually, his fingers bled and were permanently stained from the ink he picked up while licking his fingers before wiping them on his clothes. The list goes on. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, had explosive bouts of flatulence. Henry VIII, who likes his fountains and his walks, also liked to wrestle bears. Once, according to legend, he grabbed a bear by the ears, rode it around the room and threw it out a window. Francis I, King of France, enjoyed nothing more than jousting, except that he did it badly. He had no idea what he was doing, and he crashed spectacularly. Once, his horse reared up and fell backward. Another time, he ran straight into an opponent, and they both tumbled to the ground. Then there's Richard the Lionheart, a legendary medieval warrior, except historians have noted that he was terrible at fighting. Once, during the Third Crusade, he got separated from his troops and found himself locked inside a church. When he broke out, his knights came under attack from a group of peasants. Richard panicked and fled, giving up his armor to speed himself up. To say he wasn't a natural soldier would be an understatement. So remember that next time you hear about a noble lineage or a mighty dynasty, beneath the glorious mantle of power lurked a secret danger. The bloodline could dry up, turning a crown from gold to rust. And when they weren't busy securing kingdoms or fighting wars, medieval royals were often busy making messes of their own lives. They were human beings first, after all, and their foibles, failures, and neuroses were as petty and personal as anyone else's.
Why do I do this to myself? First, I spend hours researching these videos. Then, I edit for days, and then I ramble for 20 minutes about what I wish I'd remembered to research better. Well, here goes nothing. We're back in the medieval classroom. Today's lesson, how royal parents messed up raising their kids. Oh, don't worry, we're talking about our favorite royal brats, Mary, Queen of Scots, Edward VI, and Joan of Arc. Okay, let's start with the basics. Royal babies were rarely planned. Marriage was the foundation of medieval power, and having kids legitimized a ruler's claim. But exactly when to get married and have kids was a game of political chess. Rulers usually wed in their late teens and early 20s, which means royal childhoods were usually pretty short. Henry VIII was only 17 when he married his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. You can look up the math. So, yeah, medieval kids grew up fast. Most royals followed a regimented routine laid out by tutors, governors, and mothers. Schooling started young. Even before age 5, kids were tutored in religion, reading, writing, and Latin. Music, art, and literature were important too, as were hunting, hawking, and other sports suitable for nobility. At night, it was bed by candlelight, prayers, and then off to sleep. Hopefully, royal children were taught morality and virtue, except when they weren't. God knows kings and queens could be terrible role models. Richard the Lionheart was famed as a martial hero, but his son, John Lackland, was a short, stocky bully. Henry V loved crusading, but his father, Henry IV, preferred brawling. One biographer called him a liar and adulterer. And who could forget King Charles II, known for luxury, debauchery, and losing his kingdom. Kids saw this too, so royal upbringing wasn't just about lessons. It was also about expectations. The Plantagenet dynasty of England had this expectation. A king's heir must be strong and valiant. If a boy seemed weak, it was a disaster. Enter Edward VI. Born in 1284, he was the firstborn son of King Edward I. But Edward I didn't care much for kids. He spent most of Edward VI's childhood crusading in Wales and making mischief with his mistress. So Edward VI grew up in the care of his mother, Queen Eleanor, a dragon lady of Aquitaine, who made her own disastrous marriage to King Henry II. Talk about bad parenting. So what did she do? Well, she smothered Edward VI with love, but in her own way. She delighted in his intellectual side, teaching him languages, poetry, and music. While the royal court expected a warrior, Eleanor created a scholar. But here's the problem. Eleanor was more interested in her own interests than producing a proper king. When she died, Edward VI was barely literate, thanks to her obsession with keeping him entertained, not schooled. Can you imagine the royal tutor in 1297 giving a history lecture to a bunch of bored kids while Edward VI doodles pictures of his beloved cat? Well, unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. This is one of the famous Cartae de Registro, documents listing everything Edward VI read during his childhood. And, well, this isn't exactly War and Peace. History isn't really Edward VI's forte. Luckily, he had his counselors to run the kingdom while he dabbled in painting. Of course, this left the realm in chaos. The barons hated Edward VI's counselors. Edward VI couldn't care less. Then, after 8 years of mild amusement, Edward VI died. No one knows if he was poisoned, but given his diet of wine and sweets, maybe it was just diabetes. Either way, his half-sister, Margaret of Burgundy, inherited the throne. Great. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Medieval succession was a minefield. You may have been born first, but unless you were a boy, that didn't matter. Henry V waited until his brother, King Henry VI, was 30 to seize the throne. That's a long time to wait. Margaret of Burgundy reigned over England for 3 months before her cousin, King Edward III, swooped in and made himself king. See, this is why royal kids need to learn the fundamentals: how to fight, how to rule, and how to grab the crown. But Edward VI never learned any of this. He couldn't even chase a ball without huffing and puffing. Here's a contemporary description of Edward VI on horseback. Quote, "My lord was riding that day upon a courser of good mettle, but the horse stumbled somewhat, and my lord fell down at the entry of the water. But anon, rising up, mounted again, and so rode through the town." Wow, sounds brave. Or maybe it's just sad. So let's try a different student. Someone whose story is far more infamous. Mary, Queen of Scots. Born in 1542, she was next in line for the English throne after her cousin, King Edward VI. And Edward VI had no kids, so Mary was poised to inherit. Except for one small problem: her mother, Mary of Guise, was French, and Mary of Guise had married an Italian. And Mary of Scots, as a result, spoke excellent French, but almost no English. So Mary grew up speaking French. In fact, she didn't learn English until she came to live in the court of her great-aunt, the future Queen Elizabeth I. And I'm sure that went swimmingly. Not so much. You'll have to check out the series for that whole story. But suffice to say, Mary was deeply unpopular. Her claim to the English throne was seen as tainted by her foreign ties, and she spent much of her life locked up in castles. She was executed in 1587. Did having a rough childhood make her queenly failure inevitable? Maybe. But it doesn't mean Mary was completely hapless. Like Edward VI, Mary was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and a patron of the arts. History remembers her primarily as a victim of circumstance, and with good reason. But medieval schooling was clearly working somewhere because Mary knew how to wield a book as well as a scepter. But our final child of royalty has a story that's perhaps more frustrating. Joan of Arc was born into a peasant family, but she was raised at the French royal court. She became famous for hearing voices that told her to free France from the English. She led armies to victory, rescued the Dauphin, and was later tried for heresy, burned at the stake. There's a movie about it. But this raises the question: did anyone tutor Joan of Arc? The truth is probably not. Her story is mostly myth, and there's little record of her education. She was probably homeschooled by her mother, Joachim, but we don't know what Joachim taught her. Given her piety, she likely drilled Joan in Catholicism. And given her daughter's future career, maybe she worked in some basic reading, writing, and sword fighting. But we simply don't know. Joan's story is either divine inspiration or psychotic break. And her education fits right in the middle. What we do know is that no one prepared Joan of Arc for the trials ahead. She wasn't a queen or princess, so she had no regimented schedule. Yet she rose to become one of the most famous figures in medieval France. Unfortunately, that fame turned on her and the English killed her. But like many medieval children, Joan of Arc was self-made. So there you have it. Medieval royalty was hard on kids. Short childhoods, crazy parents, and careers thrust upon them. Add in religious fervor, toxic courts, and rampant war, and you get a generation of spoiled brats with complex psychological issues. Hope that was helpful. Come back soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to the channel. Do you ever look at your family tree and feel a shiver of, concern? Like maybe Aunt Edna should have married someone else, or, you know, that whole marrying your cousin thing probably wasn't such a great idea. Well, turns out those weird family dynamics were pretty normal in royal families, especially in Europe between the 13th and 18th centuries. They were playing a dangerous game with the genetic deck. Today, we are deep diving into the royal mating game. It's a bit of a dicey subject, but hey, at least it's educational. So why did royals marry so close? Well, it wasn't just about family values. Although they were super into that, there are two big reasons behind this pattern. First, keeping it in the family, kind of literally. Back in the Middle Ages, kingship was hereditary, typically passing from father to son. Marrying outside the royal family diluted that bloodline, which was a problem if you were trying to establish a dynasty. Think of it like owning a rare, valuable breed of dog. You wouldn't mix them with any old mutt, right? You'd want to keep the bloodlines pure. That's what royals were doing, just with humans. Now, there were exceptions to this rule. For example, marriages with commoners occasionally happened, although the children of these unions usually didn't have the same claim to the throne. But generally, royals kept it within the extended family circle. Second, political convenience. Alliances were critical for monarchs. Marrying into other royal lines created bonds that went beyond blood. It was a way of saying, we're connected. Don't mess with us. Plus, these partnerships could smooth over conflicts and create trust. It was diplomacy with a dash of romance. Sometimes the two reasons overlapped. For instance, marrying a cousin secured both the bloodline and an alliance with another kingdom. So you get double duty out of one wedding. Anyway, that's the backstory. Now, let's meet the cast of characters. The first family we need to meet is the Spanish Habsburgs. They were a royal dynasty that dominated large parts of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, if you've ever heard of that ridiculously famous painting of a royal with a big old chin, yeah, that's a Habsburg. They were the quintessential royal family of the era and also a prime example of keeping it in the family a little too far. The Habsburgs intermarried extensively, meaning they regularly married within their own family tree. And we're not talking about marrying your cousin once removed. We're talking marrying your first cousin, second cousin, sometimes even third cousins. They were playing the marriage lottery and hoping for the best. Or maybe just resigned to the fact that they'd have a lot of kids with last names like Habsburg. Given this pattern, it shouldn't be a surprise that many Habsburg children struggled with health issues. You see, when you shuffle the family gene pool like that, you increase the chances of offspring inheriting harmful recessive genes from both parents. And you guessed it, those recessive genes could cause all sorts of problems from physical ailments to developmental disorders. Basically, the odds of having a perfectly healthy kid got smaller and smaller with each generation of Habsburg offspring, and they knew this. So why did they keep going down this road? Well, for that, we go back to our original reasons, keeping it in the family and political convenience. By marrying within their dynasty, the Habsburgs ensured the continuation of their bloodline. They also avoided the risk of diluting their power by marrying outside of it. As a bonus, these marriages often came with political benefits, strengthening alliances and expanding influence. So they were sealing the deal for the family business on a genetic level, but not without consequences. The Habsburg children, many of whom were destined for greatness, often started off as sickly infants. Some didn't make it to adulthood at all. In a twisted way, the family's obsession with preserving its bloodline contributed to its eventual decline. Okay, moving on. The English royal family during the Tudor and Stuart periods, that's the mid-1500s to mid-1600s, had their own complicated relationship with the gene pool. Henry VIII, the infamous king with 6 wives, had a particular fondness for marrying his relatives. Talk about a family man, but not in the wholesome sense. Henry wed his brother's widow, his sister, and even had designs on his own daughter. This man was determined to keep things in the family. Now, why did he do this? Well, part of it was his quest to produce a male heir. Henry famously toppled the monasteries and changed the course of England's religious history so he could marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Why? Because he wanted a son. When that didn't work out, he tried again with another relative. You see, Henry had been advised that certain relatives shared a special blood connection, making it easier to have sons. He was chasing a myth, a pseudoscience, and it landed him in a tangled web of family ties. Of course, we now know that such beliefs were unfounded, but in the 16th century, they were taken seriously, and so Henry persisted, shuffling his family tree looking for that elusive son. Was he successful? Well, partially. He finally had a male heir, but it was with another relative, and that son, Edward VI, was sickly and died young, setting the stage for even more marital complications. As for Henry's other children, they navigated a minefield of royal intrigue, including exile and execution. If anyone epitomized the phrase "children of divorce," it was them. So, lesson learned. Messing with the family tree might seem like a shortcut, but sometimes it leads to a dead end. And now we come to a family drama that sounds straight out of a Shakespeare play, but is actually scarier than fiction. The House of Valois in France. They held the throne from the 1300s to the 1600s, and their family squabbles would put the Kardashians to shame. Compounding the issue was a generous helping of inbreeding. Over the years, the Valois intermarried with other royal lines like the Capet, Bourbon, and most notably, the Habsburg. These unions, intended to strengthen the bloodline and forge alliances, instead introduced more genetic complexity. As we now understand, mixing different gene pools isn't always a recipe for robust health, yet the Valois kept doubling down. They married cousins, nieces to uncles, even had instances of uncle-niece marriage. It was a genetic gamble, and they lost. Many Valois heirs suffered from health problems ranging from hemophilia to mental illness. And this wasn't just a 1 or 2 generation thing, it was consistent across multiple branches of the family. The Habsburg connection was particularly troublesome. Charles V of France, a descendant of Valois, married Isabella of Bourbon, a Habsburg princess. This union combined the genetic challenges of both families, setting the stage for a slew of hereditary conditions among their descendants. Among the afflicted was Marie, Queen of Scotland and grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots. She had a serious case of hemophilia, a condition where the blood doesn't clot properly, making even minor injuries life-threatening. Her brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, also suffered from a severe form of hemophilia. And don't forget the infamous Francis I, the flamboyant Renaissance monarch who took on Michelangelo's David as a gift. He too was a carrier of hemophilia. The French royal family became known for their artistic patronage and military campaigns, but also for passing on bleeding disorders. Their family tree is a testament to the risks of ignoring nature's red flags and the perils of thinking you're invincible because you're royalty. So, what's the takeaway? Royalty wasn't all it was cracked up to be, especially when it came to genetics. As we've seen, these privileged families gambled with their bloodlines and often lost. Sickly children, unexpected deaths, hereditary disorders, they were all too common. But maybe the biggest tragedy was the missed opportunities. If these families had diversified their gene pool, they might have avoided a lot of heartache. Perhaps they could have produced healthier heirs and staved off some of their dynasty's biggest blunders. But instead, they played it safe, sticking within their own circles and hoping for the best. Genetics 101 tells us that's not a smart move. But sometimes, even when we know better, we don't always do better. Thanks for joining us on this Royal Rumble through the world of messed up family trees. Before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe. And hey, why not share your own family's quirky tales in the comments? You never know. Your story might just be our next topic.
Henry VIII has gone down in history as a tyrant, a religious reformer, a conqueror. He's had a surprisingly large impact on the world. But what did he do during his downtime? Surprisingly, for a man who executed 2 of his wives, he liked nothing more than domesticity. At least that's according to his biographers. They describe Henry as a loving father, especially to his daughter Mary. He read to her, took her hunting, danced with her, and walked by her side as a miniature queen consort. He did the same with his daughter Elizabeth, though their relationship cooled after Elizabeth's mother was executed. But then there was the small matter of the wives he murdered, and the rest of the children he largely ignored. Maybe his real passion was interior design. We get a hint from a poem written around 1540, addressed to "My Dearest Husband." Most of it is taken up with descriptions of household projects and furnishings, right down to how velvet cushions were fixed on stools. These weren't exactly grand concerns for a king, but they were Henry's. When you think about it, this domesticity fits the medieval mindset. Kingship was basically an extension of managing a household. Peasants paid taxes just as servants paid fees. A lord's wife managed his estate just as his queen might manage a royal building project. And everyone followed the orders of the male head of the household. As the medieval writer Christine de Pizan put it, the king must be obeyed absolutely in all things. So when Henry VIII delighted in decorating rooms, he was really acting like an especially rich lord of a manor. His favorite residence was Whitehall Palace, where he installed a massive fountain in the Great Hall. He later moved to the palace at Greenwich, where he delighted in landscaping the gardens and decorating the walls with new tapestries. In fact, he was so enthusiastic about decorating that he once dispatched 6 men to scour England for old tapestry hangings, then had them restored and sent to Greenwich. In the end, Henry probably wasn't much of a kingly king, but he was a terrific interior decorator. Louis XIV of France had different hobbies. He loved hunting. Over the course of his long life, he hunted tens of thousands of animals, particularly deer. He created special parks near Versailles, where hundreds of deer grazed, then stalked them during walks that could last for hours. Louis took such pleasure in tracking down his prey that he designed special hunting lodges where he could rest between chases. He liked to follow trails all over France. On one occasion, he spent 8 days walking around the forest of Fontainebleau. To stay fit for all this running around, Louis took long walks. According to his doctor, he averaged 25 miles per day. He also used a special treadmill in his apartments at Versailles, which he apparently preferred to riding a horse. For our American viewers, that sounded weird too. But no king was more obsessed with food than James I of England. In fact, his fondness for eating became a national scandal. During his reign, Parliament tried to limit the size of his meals because they felt it was outrageous. But James wasn't having it. "I have heard," he said to Parliament, "that some have been so bold as to wish that I would eat less. But my answer is that I could never eat amiss." There may have been something to that claim. Some estimates suggest that over his lifetime, James ate over 30,000 chickens, along with prodigious amounts of venison, beef, mutton, swan, peacock, rabbit, eel, fish, and bread. Of course, those meals required lots of wine, and James developed a taste for France's finest vintages, collecting thousands of bottles. The king's favorite meal consisted of 3 dishes of swan, each prepared in a different way. One was roasted with spices and covered in gold leaf. Another was stewed with medicinal herbs. The third was boiled and seasoned with nutmeg. He liked it all washed down with a flagon of Canary wine, a thick, sweet wine from the Canary Islands. James was so devoted to the stuff that he actually brought some vines back to England and planted them at Greenwich House. But no medieval ruler was more famous for his odd habits than Ivan the Terrible of Russia. He was a cruel, violent man who ruled with terror, but he also suffered from debilitating neuroses. Historians debate whether he had epilepsy or some other sickness, but its symptoms followed him all his life. He experienced terrifying seizures that left him twitching and babbling. His limbs shook uncontrollably, and his eyes rolled wildly in his head. At his worst moments, he would foam at the mouth and bite down hard on his own tongue. Unsurprisingly, these spells left him exhausted. Ivan the Terrible was notorious for sleeping for days at a time. He would crawl into bed wearing a nightgown, then refuse to come out until it was time for dinner. Even then, he was too tired to eat. Instead, he would have his food ground into a liquid, then drink it straight from the mortar. He also developed a disturbing habit of biting his fingers so hard that he broke the bones. He was especially fond of eating the flesh off his thumbs. Unsurprisingly, this made writing and eating painful. His solution: hire someone to feed him while he dictated letters. Ivan would dictate everything from state policy to personal matters, like asking for fresh cherries, bread, wine, and plums. He also demanded food while he slept. Servants reported carrying trays of soup into Ivan's bedroom at night and watching him drink hungrily from a spoon. Of course, his night nurse wasn't the only one. As Ivan aged, he became convinced that he was being poisoned. First, he suspected his wife, then his son, then everyone else in his inner circle. So he hired an army of food tasters and night nurses to watch over him. It was hardly an improvement. One of his last night nurses was a former serf named Osip, who was given the title Prince Borshik. He watched over Ivan for 12 years, but that didn't make him any less terrified. Every time, he wrote, when I went to fetch a spoonful of soup, I trembled lest my master should die during the interval between the time when I had drunk the broth and that when he partook of it. Rulers like Ivan the Terrible had plenty of nervous habits. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, couldn't stop biting his fingernails. His counselors despaired over the damage it was doing to his looks, and it got worse over time. Eventually, his fingers bled and were permanently stained from the ink he picked up while licking his fingers before wiping them on his clothes. The list goes on. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, had explosive bouts of flatulence. Henry VIII, who likes his fountains and his walks, also liked to wrestle bears. Once, according to legend, he grabbed a bear by the ears, rode it around the room and threw it out a window. Francis I, King of France, enjoyed nothing more than jousting, except that he did it badly. He had no idea what he was doing, and he crashed spectacularly. Once, his horse reared up and fell backward. Another time, he ran straight into an opponent, and they both tumbled to the ground. Then there's Richard the Lionheart, a legendary medieval warrior, except historians have noted that he was terrible at fighting. Once, during the Third Crusade, he got separated from his troops and found himself locked inside a church. When he broke out, his knights came under attack from a group of peasants. Richard panicked and fled, giving up his armor to speed himself up. To say he wasn't a natural soldier would be an understatement. So remember that next time you hear about a noble lineage or a mighty dynasty, beneath the glorious mantle of power lurked a secret danger. The bloodline could dry up, turning a crown from gold to rust. And when they weren't busy securing kingdoms or fighting wars, medieval royals were often busy making messes of their own lives. They were human beings first, after all, and their foibles, failures, and neuroses were as petty and personal as anyone else's.
It's our favorite day of the week, Ask a Historian. And today, we're answering questions from the internet about everything from Empress Matilda and modern royal families to the strangest food ever eaten. All right, let's do this thing. Question number 1. If Empress Matilda of England had won the Civil War against Stephen, would the Plantagenet line end with her son Henry II instead of starting with him? Ask this person. That's not how genetics work. You can't kill someone's grandparents and change their parents. So regardless of who sat on the throne, Henry II's parents would still be alive and well making babies. However, if Matilda had won, she may have held on to the throne for longer than Stephen did, meaning she would have likely outlived him. In that case, Her son Henry would indeed become the first Plantagenet king, although arguably he was always the second in line, having been born while Stephen was king. Question number 2. If there was a royal pig assassination plot, would it be legal for the queen consort to seek revenge, or would she need to summon Parliament to declare war? Well, let's hope the queen consort doesn't get too trigger-happy. As long as the plot involved only the pigs, it's probably not grounds for war. Unless the queen consort is charged with the murder of said conspirators, seeking revenge would fall outside the bounds of the law. And in all seriousness, here's hoping it never happens. Question number 3. Do you think Constantine the Great really dreamed of moving Rome to Byzantium? Yeah, I don't think he really wanted to move Rome. Why would he want to do that? It's an amazing city, sure. But I mean, where's the beef? There are more cows in Latium than in Thrace. It's true, just look at the numbers. Also, Rome was in the process of getting extremely big under his successors. So, yeah, I don't think that's what he meant. What he was trying to do was bring the empire back to its eastern center of gravity after the crises of the 3rd century, which is why he built his new capital at the easily defensible Byzantium. Question number 4. I think it's funny that even when royalty die, they still cause drama. Here, take this royal pig assassination attempt as an example. People have been arguing over whether the queen should or shouldn't seek revenge. What do you think? Personally, I am struggling to find a source for this royal pig assassination attempt. Can anyone provide more information about this story so that we can determine the veracity of the claim? Also, I'm kind of on board with the queen consort seeking revenge on behalf of her husband, the king. After all, is he not her property? This is a medieval mentality and does not reflect my own views whatsoever. Question number 5. When will we learn the results of King Charles's DNA test? How will we know if he's descended from the last official royal line of Scotland? Honestly, I have no idea how genetic testing works. I just read the news stories. But given that the late Queen Elizabeth II was publicly identified as a descendant of King David II of Scotland, King Charles's descent from the Scottish royal line is well established and hardly a subject for genetic testing. Does anyone else remember all those tests done in the 90s that claimed to prove various popes and monarchs weren't related as popularly believed? They all came back confirming the suspicions. So, you got that. Question number 6. Why did King Louis the Pious divide the Holy Roman Empire among his sons? Was it to prevent another conflict like the War of the Cousins? Perhaps because Louis the Pious was fond of saying that to reign, one must be 3. That is to say, it takes 3 people to run an empire. So, in theory, each of his sons would get one part of his role, and together they'd be a good little team. Unfortunately, they were anything but a good team, and this led to a bunch of wars. But at least he tried, right? Question number 7. Did the King of England during the Peasants' Revolt realize how ridiculously out of touch he was when he literally carried on partying after hearing about the rebels heading his way? Yes, absolutely. But he didn't care. The man was the epitome of detached nobility. You want to know the real reason Richard II went ahead and partied while the peasants marched on London? He didn't believe they were any real threat. And in fact, his counselors advised him to meet the rebels halfway and try to negotiate terms. So when the rebels got closer and a messenger told Richard that he needed to leave his revelry and attend to the crisis, he famously replied, "I see no such matter. These men come to receive my royal wages." Question number 8. Are there any historical figures who seem to have been reincarnated multiple times throughout history? One can only hope. Think of all the lives Genghis Khan has lived. The man was pure evil. Can you imagine coming back as him? At least he seems to show up again and again. But honestly, I think it's obvious that people like Adolf Hitler and Osama bin Laden are the reincarnation of Satan himself. They literally embody evil. Question number 9. Has it ever occurred to you that if Queen Victoria had married her cousin, Prince Albert, Instead of her first cousin once removed, she wouldn't have had a consort, but rather a co-monarch? Technically, Victoria and Albert were first cousins once removed, not second cousins as commonly stated. So, yeah, Victoria wouldn't have been able to make Albert her consort, but she could certainly have made him her co-monarch, even though Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were first cousins once removed, not second cousins as commonly stated. So, yeah, Victoria wouldn't have been able to make Albert her consort, but she could certainly have made him her co-monarch. Question number 10. Would the U.S. have been better off if Martha Washington had died on the midship? Martha Washington losing John Paul Jones in battle would have devastated George. But I don't think it would have been better for the country. The nation was built by many hands, both men and women, and Martha was an integral part of the early republic. Don't forget, she presided over a dinner for 16 future government leaders at the age of 18. I also think it's important to consider that the notion of the United States even existing without Martha Washington is absurd. She was present for the Constitutional Convention, and her land holdings helped finance the American Revolution. Losing her could have lost the country its founding mother. Question number 11. I wonder if King Charles has asked his mom for tips on being a monarch. No. The Queen was notoriously private about matters relating to the monarchy, especially with regard to her son. It's unlikely she shared any thoughts she may have had on the topic. And even if she did, it's unlikely Charles would share that information with us. Regardless, King Charles has certainly benefited from the knowledge that his mother accumulated over her 70-year reign. And I hope it serves him well. Question number 12. Who was the first to invent the toothbrush? And was it used in ancient times? No. The modern toothbrush was invented by William Addis, an English prison inmate in the 18th century. He fashioned the first toothbrush from a bone handle and some bristles taken from a wild boar's brush. Question number 13. Which was the first European royal house to interdict its own members' behavior? E. Banning marriage to certain relatives. Interestingly enough, the Danish royal house was one of the first to do this. In 1256, King Eric VI, seeing how poorly previous royal marriages had worked out for the kingdom, decreed that all his descendants were forbidden from marrying specified relatives. This included, of course, siblings, parents, and children, but also aunts, uncles, nieces, and nephews. Love 'em or hate 'em, the Danes knew what was best for their royal family. Question number 14. Is there any truth to the rumors about Queen Elizabeth I farting very frequently? Absolutely not. This is a nasty rumor spread by her rivals at court. They tried to slander her by linking her to flatulence, a bodily function long associated with female lewdness. It's a classic smear tactic, but it didn't work. And question number 15. What was the weirdest meal ever eaten by a royal or other famous person? Edward VIII, while Duke of Windsor, supposedly enjoyed a bowl of kippers served with brown sauce and a slice of bread and butter pudding. Sounds delicious, right? Actually, it does. Kippers are smoked fish, and normally they are served with something like eggs, tomatoes, and chips. Not sure why the pudding would accompany them. But hey, British cooking, I guess. All right, that's all we have time for today. But please come back next Friday for more. Ask a historian. Ask us anything. We'll answer some more questions on Friday, and until then, keep learning.